So Kenneth, what is the most important thing to know about you?
About me? Oh, well, that I'm still the right side of the grass, I suppose. Really. Oh, goodness. I think I am uncommonly lucky insofar that I got into this trade at a time when there really weren't so many of us doing it. And the clients, who were at that time pretty much all local, they had no experience of employing designers either.
Right.
So it's a very happy sort of, catch as catch can arrangement. At the same time, there was and had been established for quite a long time a very ethical organisation, which at the time was called the Council of Industrial Design, later called the Design Council, but it was, I think, started, may even have been started in the 30s, but certainly came to its first useful role at an exhibition called Britain Can Make It. Well, this is all bloody history for you folks, I know, but it is relevant to the extent of how something got started on a very ethical, a very stable sort of base. So the Design Council, I get mixed up with what to call it, but you know what I'm talking about, had a sort of brokerage service, and anybody who thought they were qualified or had been proposed as qualified to design almost anything was on a list of designers that was held by this outfit called the Design Council. And then then a certain amount of publicity, they even were publishing a very decent magazine. It was almost all staffed by ex-service people, particularly a lot of people from the Navy. So the idea of sort of ethical behaviour, of orderly behaviour, and most of these weren't necessarily commercial people, but they'd come through with these sort of assumptions about how a society works. So as I say, this Design Council was a very honest broker between the manufacturers of almost anything at all and the people they wanted to employ, who were the designers. A number of the designers were architects as well, but I can see more and more that we owe quite a lot to the assumptions that were growing up then, and it was all about behaviour, it was all about relative generosity. I don't ever remember being badly beaten about and knocked down when it came to money, for example. And it was, our demands were quite modest, and I think their expectation was they had no idea what to be asked to pay. Occasionally you'd hear a tale about a company, Kodak in particular, had employed an American designer, and they were talking about sort of astronomical money by their terms and by mine, so whatever you charge was a bloody bargain. Anyway, terrible opportunity to say all sorts of things I wasn't asked, but...
You mentioned that a lot of those people were ex-services and you did national service. How do you think that affected the designer that you became?
Difficult to answer it, but I think I have quite a fond memory. I certainly didn't look at it at all fondly when it came up. I was 18 or whatever it was, or 19, I think, and eventually the papers came and this, that, and the other, and so I was drafted into the army, and it was in the beginning fairly unpleasant and bloody rigorous. Physically rigorous, and you pitchforked into a society, a group of, say, 40 men from a terrific variety of backgrounds. You can't believe the mixture of people from the highest of the highlands to the lowest of the lowlands, and all the sort of Herberts and villains and all sorts of funny people in between, from a terrific spectrum of society. And that's pretty hard to imagine how that's going to happen today. But by this august institution, you were just told that's what you're going to do. And so you joined this group and you got on with it. Now, I think on reflection, you learned a hell of a lot about getting on with people when the bloke in the next bed was eventually found never to have washed all the time we were there. I mean, I'm not joking. I mean, the scope of differences that you were pitchforked into was, on reflection, a wonderful learning curve. And also, you know, I think you're either blessed with a certain amount of luck or an exceptional amount of luck. I think I got an exceptional lot of luck. So there was a time when, after I'd been through that, you know, rigorous 6-9 months of just basic training, as they call it, when you are trained to be sort of cannon fodder, that's the real purpose of the army. You get lots of people who get sort of shove at a lot of other people and they die, and that's called war. And so it doesn't matter very much what this group of 40 people are or where they came from. That's the origin of war. It's straightforward cannon fodder, as it's called, and it's a pretty good description. So after that preparation, they then start to see to what extent you can be more useful in a sort of process of managing the army. And I was drafted into what they call the engineers, and in the engineers there's a terrific spectrum of systems. They have architects even, and they have builders, and they have painting departments and transport departments, a terrific scope. So if you read a bit of news today about, you know, some terrible bloody affair going on somewhere, some of the first most important army men are those who are in the engineers, because they will be given the job of crossing a river or mending a road or mending a railway. So they're absolutely essential beginners of the rest of the process of carrying on the war. So the engineers, I didn't rang on so much ever before about this, but it's true, the engineers are pretty bloody important. And in the engineers, they have an architectural department.
Right.
Well, I was in a regiment which was, it doesn't matter about that, but I was, as it were, befriended by an interviewing officer, because somewhere on the way I thought it'd be quite nice to be an officer, you know, with all that Sam Brown and the polished outfit and telling people what to do. And I'm only 19, for Christ's sake, and pretty glamorous prospect. And it seemed that was possible if you kept your face clean and so on, you might get there. But this fellow said, you don't want to do that. He said, look, you know, you've been to art school, you came direct from the army via a short period in an architectural office. You know, it's not the future for you. And I would advise you strongly against trying to become an officer. But I'll make you like an infantile version of an architect. So they have an architectural category, and I was called an architectural grade 3. And I got more money, which was also pretty attractive. But thereafter, this little category you'd be put into was planted in different places. So I was then planted, only myself, in a bloody great camp of other soldiers, and I had my own funny little office. And most of the work I did was helping my boss, the local officer, to paint the backgrounds for his amateur theatricals, which is the most important thing in his life. So I fell on my feet, and then from there I got somehow drafted into, which was important, a department which actually printed instruction books. And in the instruction books, you can imagine if you're taking a tank apart or a bridge or a gun apart, the quality of the drawing as a piece of information, a piece of learning, pretty damned important. So this department was full of wonderful draftsmen, wonderful artists, whose job was to dismember mechanisms and draw them into elegant diagrams, which would then be published to give to these poor buggers who might fire them one day. So there I learned about printing, and I learned about the value of illustration, and I learned about it's the origins of an interest and a thought process about where graphics can be useful, as opposed to entertaining or informative, etc. We're never going to get through the day at this rate, are we? Sorry.
It's all so interesting, so I'm not going to cut you off, I'm afraid. You mentioned that you were a drafting assistant and you worked for architects like Katz and Vaughan when they were working on the Festival of Britain and later for Jack Howe.
Yeah.
And you've talked about working for people like that as the other part of your education. Tell me a little bit about some of those people and how they influenced you.
Well, I think it was the most influential thing in my life, actually, because I came from my dad was a policeman and my mum worked in a factory and so on. I was a very happy home, but very conservative, very predictable, you know, tassels, uncut moquette, red, cream, you know, the actual perfect vernacular of sort of middle class, well, lower middle class, working class doesn't matter. I mean, you all aspire to have the same sort of, you know, appurtenance, the same sort of decoration around the home. And that's why everybody has a stag at bay on the wall and all that stuff, you see. So there's an absolute vernacular of what made common taste. So that's where I came from, eggs and bacon and red and cream. But there I landed a job in an architect's office. I didn't even know what architects did. You can't believe how ignorant I was. I don't glamorise this, it's an absolute truth. And I went to work in this office as a sort of gopher. I got a very modest job. But all the walls were white, the doors were painted different colours, and the most unlikely furniture I'd ever met in my whole bloody life, that was their world. And it's what today you can see was modernism. And it was so refreshing and so, don't even think, I thought it was a glimpse of the future, but it was their world. And they were such agreeable people and decent people and generous people. And in every way, the sort of people you could imagine then being absolute discovery. You went from school where you had a society, you went through the army, which was another sort of society, and suddenly this was like the best sort of place you could be. And it was absolute influence, never ever lost me, and I still bang on about it as I will today.
Tell me about the moment that you brought the Atomic Energy Authority exhibition project into Jack Howe and he told you to resign and go and do it on your own. That must have been quite terrifying.
Well, and again, it's typical of, I think, that sort of society, the architectural society, because I think for the most part, they're generous instinct. And so he encouraged his assistants, there were only 3 of us, to do any work that came along. And I got to do the odd painting, a bit of a mural here and a bit of a so-and-so there. And I landed minor exhibitions, bits and pieces, just displays for exhibitions, and one after another. And then I landed one, God knows where it started, where they came to call me in his office, but I got a job from the Atomic Energy Authority, which was the government established supra organisation to manage the use of nuclear physics in the future. Now, we knew about the nuclear bombs and this, that and the other, but nuclear energy was also, and it came to the top quickly, the use of isotopes, for example, in medicine. So that's a direct part of the whole nuclear world. And also they were talking about nuclear energy, nuclear power stations. So this is a tiny organisation, 3 people running the PR department of what became an immense organisation called the Atomic Energy Authority. And they asked me to design a little exhibition on the South Bank called, can make it like Nuclear is Good or something, I can't remember. And so I did this little exhibition and I was paid for it and it was a relative success. They were pleased. And so I went away. And then one day, right out of the blue, 6 months later, the same people called me and said, we've got another job, would you like to do it? So of course I said yes. And off I go in my lunchtime on the bus and whatever, and I go to this office down in the city, and they had got this job, which was then the first of a big went on for year on year, went to a big exhibition in Geneva about the peaceful uses of atomic energy as a sort of big symposium right across Europe. A big event you can see historically. And of course I said yes, and love to do it. On the way back in the bus, I realised what I'd said yes to, which was a huge job. I mean, just in square footage, like bigger than this whole bloody building. I mean, immense. And I thought, you know, we've cut off, bitten off more than you can chew today, Grange. So I thought, I know what I'll do. Jack, who's done the odd exhibition design, a proper architect, very organised outfit, I thought he'll be delighted to get the job, so as it were, give him the job, as long as I can do it in the office. So I'm still just an oik, you know, I'm still only 21 or 2 or something, a kid really. And I went into Jack and I said, look, there's this job that I've been offered and I'd like to, you know, like you to do it. And to my horror, I really shat myself. He said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. I think you should do it. And he had the wit and the generosity to see that this might be the making of a man's life. And it was. And so I left him that week, because it was only got 6 months on to go or something. And within a month I was employing 4 people. A huge job, and of course it grew and grew. They then decided they wanted it in 5 languages and then 9 languages. So the amount of graphics, I mean, I was trotting out graphic design all night. So the other thing that I think I would say, if you ask me what's the most important thing about your armoury, if you're going to be a success in our trade, is actually you've got to be prepared to work at least 80 hours a week. Week on week, year on year. And a journalist came to see me quite a long time ago and looked at all the stuff I'd done and said, you must be a lot older than you look. And I said, no, it's true, but you have to remember that I've just worked a lot more, not necessarily better, but I've just worked more hours. So you can't avoid overtaking anybody else, can you? I mean, it's just certainty that you can make the biggest blunders in the world, but the likelihood is, on average, you're still going to overtake your competitors just because you put more time in. Yeah. So somewhere in my makeup and in the family, whatever, I've got an instinct for work. And I think if I'm not working, I think I'm not worth it, you know. Sorry, go on.
You talk a lot about the generosity that people showed you as a young designer, and that there's a lot of talk now as young designers are coming through that companies are sort of exploiting them, and you know, the whole debate about unpaid internships. And I agree with you that I think you have to work incredibly hard to make a success. But do you think there is still that generosity towards the next generation in the design industry?
I think it's still instinctively in a lot of people, and I think, without being sure of my ground, but my feeling is that if I meet an architect, there's a pretty good chance that they're a fairly decent person. And it follows, therefore, that they're likely to be decent employers and therefore relatively generous. Yeah. Now, against that, the whole scene, the whole society is forced into less and less generosity. An illustration of that is that when I worked for Kodak, and I was the first consultant they'd ever employed, and I was employed with them for 30 or 40 years, a long time. I was the only one they employed, and they used to tell me to increase the fees. Now, they could only do that because it was the sort of thing they did. They benefited from having a very good supporting system that they relied upon, be they the painters who painted the buildings, or be they the suppliers who supplied the bits and pieces. If they could keep that supply force in good order, then if there's an emergency, those people be relied on to get you out of it. So even on that level. But I think the money was so big, I think the Kodaks of this life, be they the Polaroid or the Xerox or be the big corporations of the 60s, 70s and 80s, were so wealthy, they made so much money, they had grown up being generous between themselves. I mean, their own behaviour one to another. You never heard of somebody being sacked and with their cardboard box on the pavement the next day. That's it was not a story you ever heard. They could just afford, because they were made so much money. The whole process of their working life was actually what I call generous. Now, I benefited from that, but so today, year on year, every damn thing you touch, you cannot buy anything without knowing that next week it'll be moved to another part of the department store because they can charge more for it, or they've hooked you a little bit faster. It's a great world of grasping every opportunity. Now, I don't think it's that it makes them bad people. It's just that we've made a world where money is the absolute only driver, and therefore you're hard pressed to build an organism like a company which is wealthy enough to be generous. There are a few cases where I think it still happens. I think, for example, Dyson, I know James Dyson very well, and I think as a person, he is temperamentally generous. He makes enough money out of his stuff that he can then make generosity the attitude within the firm. Yeah. I think that's a fantastic thing, and it may be that it happens in the States were also similar. The big corporations in America were very generous, certainly to the outsiders, to the suppliers. If you landed a consultancy in America, you were home for life in money terms, because they instinctively pay a lot to the best people they can buy.
Because you talked about doing projects because you felt privileged to be asked rather than for the money. And I wonder to what extent, you know, I mean, and you've touched on the answer, but to what extent young designers should feel the same way coming up through the industry now?
It's a marvellous world to be allowed into, isn't it? I mean, to you know, even get paid for enjoying yourself. You wake up and you've got something to do, something which is, you know, daftly used word, but in creative, it's uplifting, isn't it? Even if it's only repairing an old window, if you can do it really well and, you know, make light of it or do it better than the tradesman's going to do, it's all part and parcel of what makes our life worthwhile. And I think, therefore, anybody who has the good fortune to get into this trade is having a bloody life of Riley, really. It's not easy, and you get knocked about a lot. But I think underlying it all, it's still worthwhile waking up, you know.
That's good. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Pentagram. You were one of the founding partners in 1972. Tell me a little bit about that time and how Pentagram came about.
Well, like the best things, it comes about by a succession of other people's decisions, really. I'd been working for Kodak for a long time, and I knew about this outfit called Crosby Fletcher Forbes, who were one of the hotshot graphic outfits. And you also have to remember that in the years I'm talking about, which is like late 60s, the whole of the 60s, advertising, promotion, publishing, and so on, was much closer to what we now call graphics. So it wasn't novel for these guys who I came to know well to be talented graphic designers, witty, inventive, and often, you know, unlikely. They could then be employed in the role that we've come to think is only the province of advertising. I mean, for example, there was a very big printer in town who wanted some posters produced, and he wanted to distribute them among their potential clients, who were people buying print, who would be the advertising people, publishers, etc. And they asked Colin Forbes, in this case, who's one of my eventual partners, to produce a poster. And he produced a poster which I think in a way summarises the best sort of use of graphic wit. He produced a poster where he had 3 columns of signatures, and they were of Rubens' signature and Rembrandt's signature and you know, Dürer's signature. All of these in rows, all of them dead, and they'd been filched or even imagined what their signature would be. But he got these 3 lists of eminent artists, and the strap line at the bottom was, we the above deplore and oppose the idea and the installation of charges for museums and art galleries. And it was a government decision of those days. They were going to make all the galleries charge for admission. So this printer took it upon himself to actually put forward this proposition, and he used this witty assumption that all these bloody artists are certainly going to say, you know, you don't have to pay. And it was like a very good example to me of the crossover between advertising thing. So back to why Pentagram started. It's a bugger, isn't it? You ask old people what to do and they keep telling you. So I'd been working for Kodak, and I'd been entrusted with all sorts of jobs, including advice on where to go for a new corporate identity for Kodak, which is a nice, handsome job. And I knew a few of the top graphic designers, including Crosby, Fletcher, Forbes. They weren't my first choice at all. Henrian and Abraham Games, some big names in the trade, they were around and they could do it. So all these folks were then interviewed by the client, including me. I was on the client side of the table looking at these guys. And I didn't need to take the lead, but it was quite obvious that the ones who on the day were the best candidates were Crosby, Fletcher, Forbes. So we gave them the job. That's Kodak gave them the job, a nice handsome job for them, and they went off into the sunshine and did their graphics, and I'm happy on my side, on my own studio up in Hampstead. And then I got a call from Colin to say they'd landed a job for a firm called BP, and it was initially packaging, but they looked as though they were in line to get a much bigger job, which was the design of a self-service station. And would I like to come along and join in, you know, actually be a helper? And of course I said yes, and so we did this job together, and it was a wonderful job. In fact, an interesting sort of anecdote, which is again surprised to a lot of people, that at that time, so I'm talking about 1970, etc., there wasn't a self-service filling station in the whole country. Not one. Not one. But BP had heard of such places in Holland and elsewhere where the public were going to be asked to fill their own motor cars with petrol. Bloody extraordinary, isn't it? Never known. And so we landed this job to just put forward a proposition on what such a place would be. And it was a marvellous job because we were designing the equipment and the pumps and the this, that and the other and the la-di-das. And the one thing that was the biggest surprise to them, which we took the biggest difficulty persuading them to adopt, was to put a roof on it. Now, isn't that bloody extraordinary? Isn't it amazing, isn't it? You wouldn't conceive today of asking someone to do the job of an attendant who used to walk out in his bloody sou'wester and fill your tank. You wouldn't conceive of transferring that job to somebody without giving them protection. But that hadn't got through the thinking. And so the most useful thing we did was put lids over every filling station in the country. So that then led to us meeting one another much more often. I was looking for a new office with a stronger floor for the workshop, and they were looking for a new office because they were going to get slung out the old one. And so we said, well, look, why don't us both keep our eye open? If we come across a bigger building, we'll split it down the middle. But one thing led to another, and the building we found didn't split down the middle very easily. So we agreed on a common front door, and before we knew where we were in partnership. It was as unlikely as that. I'm not exaggerating. It really came about in a very unlikely, but it proved to be very successful and very happy, very, you know, in every way. Mainly because I'm to that extent a selfish bugger, and I don't think it would have been a success if they'd got an industrial designer on their team already. So we operated as sufficiently separate skills, very respectful of one another and obviously helpful of one another. You know, the clients would be notionally, we thought, certain to cross over. In fact, that was the most difficult thing of all. Most clients didn't want to cross over, and took a long time for us to land a client who wanted all that we could offer, which was architecture and product and graphics. And it happened to be a firm called Reuters, who we did everything for. But they were a rarity. Most clients came through the door wanting one particular thing. They're happy to come to a big firm for it, because they found as they got through the doors full of lovely people, and they had free lunches, and you know, it's a jolly old Beano. It's a bloody interesting thing, isn't it, that how one industry can affect another. I'm absolutely sure that the men who had the job as let's say sales director in all sorts of firms, one of the most enjoyable parts of their job is going every now and then down to the advertising agency, because there's lovely people, it's free and easy, they take their tie off, they can take their braces off, and, it's actually like a holiday. Now, what a marvellous bit of life that gives you. It's like being entrusted to spend a lot of money on somebody else's behalf, isn't it? But in this case, it was just such an agreeable thing. So I think to this extent, the advertising business were a marvellous sort of really potentially a very, very comfortable ground on which anything could grow. And it crossed over easily into design. To that extent, it crossed over more into design than the architecture did. But both became very agreeable places for a lot of commerce to go and place their business, because it meant a very agreeable time and agreeable people.
I'm quite interested in the atelier structure that Pentagram has, with independent partners, with independent business, all having an equal share in the business.
Yep.
Was that something that came about, as you said, of the way things that happen, and you wanted the industrial design bit, or was it a sort of philosophy that you wanted to instill from the beginning? Because it's still run that way, isn't it?
Yes, and I think it's a very personal way of looking at something. I think, we all think we're stars, and we all think that we're God's gift to mankind. But we'd also started, which is a great asset, we'd started and were already well established enough to have our own names, our own, marketable, as it were, product. And therefore, none of us wanted to, or there was no necessity for any of us to give up being personalities in our own right.
Yeah.
So it follows that when you start to run the firm, it's run as a set of individual businesses in a sense. And the clients like that too, because I think they know. It's like going to a big medical practice. You're quite happy to go through the door because they got bigger machines and all the rest of it. But you have to believe that that particular doctor treats you as though you were his only client. And I think it's a trick I think that the medical trade is missing at the moment. But if you were to set out a medical practice, you could have 100 doctors under on the list on the front door. But if every one of them had their own clients, so it comes to be a very intimate relationship, which is the heart of any good, consulting arrangement. I think that's very valuable. So that was the sort of model we slipped in entirely selfishly. It wasn't a piece of planning at all. It was just that we were bloody sure we weren't going to give up our own moment in the sun, and so we established it as an all practice. And it's not a bad promise to give someone, because we always had the idea, we've got one or two that have grown up inside, but you always had the idea that new partners would only be taken on if they had already made their own name, if they were known, not in a huge way, but known well enough in their own right to have their own clients who trusted them as persons. So I think that's in itself not a bad model, but you can only do it when you've been up and running long enough for you individually to have made your reputations.
You've been described as a pioneer of user-centered design, so designing products according to their purpose and function, and you've said that you want products to be a pleasure to use. Why is it so important that form follows function in that way, rather than the aesthetic taking priority?
Well, just to put the record straight, I don't think by any means I'm a pioneer in that. I think I think that's flattering and charming, but not true.
I think I'm quoting my tendency.
But it's also a bit to do with where you start your life, and I think a lot of that's pretty inescapable. I mean, I come from a very modest beginning and family and this, that, and the other, so my expectation is not that my society is in a position, we're not sort of like royalty or eminent. I don't come from any sort of eminent society. Therefore, I don't start with an assumption that I know better. Therefore, I start the only thing I can get hold of is whether it worked well or not. I mean, that I can understand. That's a common enough basis of interaction. So it just dominates my thinking, and it comes from being the wrong side of the tracks in a way. One of the problems, I think, with no, not a problem, but it's a potential problem. As professions grow, they become attractive places to grow up. You know, like the children. We used to have clients would send their kids to come and work for us. And I think when I looked then at the rather affluent life of my client, I found myself thinking, does this kid really know that it's not nearly as good? You know, it's not nearly going to be nearly as affluent when they really get their knees under the table with us. It's not where they're going to get to. If, on the other hand, they had been, as it were, indemnified or taken on in a law practice or an accountancy practice, which might have been another option for the child of this client, and in a way more appropriate, they would be introduced to the almost certainty that they're going to do well monetarily. But some of them came through our door because of the point I made earlier. It was clearly such an agreeable society. I doubt whether the equal comparison in a law firm or an accountancy firm would be just so agreeable. And agreeable even agreeable bloody floor and chairs and walls and all. And that's pretty much only lately come about. Yeah. You know, as the lawyers have realised, there's more money to be made if you look to be expensive. And expensive can mean modern, big M, you know. So that escalates the fees too. But the old tradition was good old-fashioned British brown, you know, and you knew that it was a Louis XIV chair the bloke was sitting on. That was a mark about affluence. Yeah. So there's no escaping the fact in my thinking. I don't. There's any escaping the fact that where you come from, what your family did, what all that society did, actually marks you for life. Mm-hmm. And was that the question you asked? Yes. Quite surprising.
I want to talk to you a little bit about Anglepoise because I love the story. When Simon Terry took over the business from his father, he went back to the archives for some inspiration and found a Guardian interview in which you described Anglepoise as a minor miracle of balance. And he then got in touch with you, I believe. Can you tell me a little bit about how you first met and how you came to work with Anglepoise?
Well, yes, and that's true. And I don't, you know, there's not a very dissimilar tale. I was doing an exhibition. I was doing the displays of an exhibition in Brussels for Jack Howe, who'd got a job designing a pavilion for Kodak. And it went very well. He's a very good organizer, Jack, my boss. And by then I'd left him, so this was a nice little freelance job he'd given me on my own. And I did it, and it was a great pleasure. It was a sunny day. We were ahead of time, and all I was doing was just piddling around the final details. And in the space were other people also doing like final touching up, including a bloke over there who was unpacking some boxes, one over there who was sort of sweeping up, etc., etc. And I'm pouring the drinks, all ready for the opening tomorrow. And I, really light-hearted and obviously happy as Larry that we were ahead of time, just novelty. And I said to nobody in particular, this would be a marvellous job, because I'm arranging the cameras. I'm a marvellous job if the cameras weren't so bloody ugly. And a voice over there said, well, that's interesting. What would a firm like Kodak have to pay? It was one of the workmen. What would the firm like Kodak have to pay if they wanted you or somebody like you to design a camera? And I don't know what I said, perhaps a couple of hundred, something like that. You know, really easy, free and easy sort of jokey conversation. And he said, oh, that's very interesting. And he went on doing what he did. And I went back to London that night. The following morning, the telephone rang, and a voice said, my name's Dr. Pitt. I'm Director of Development at Kodak, and I understand you've got to design a camera for us. True story. The point is that why it's so similar to Anglepoise and to Simon, if you have a conversation where there's nothing to lose, where you're relaxed and it's an easy flowing conversation, both parties begin to form an opinion about one another, and which is an eminently important personal relationship. So I think when I'm sitting, when I'm without Simon's knowledge, when somebody else I'm talking about this particularly brilliant piece of engineering, I can talk about it in flattering terms without any thought of it having any importance to me other than just hearing myself talk. And so these are both stories about being the benefit of being unprepared. You know, if you can have a conversation in easy circumstances, then chances are it'll come across as honest.
Yeah.
No ulterior motives. But there is a side bit of this that somewhere in that bit of history, I'm also sitting next to Simon, and we were at dinner, and I said to him, "What's your name?" And he said, "Terry, Simon Terry." Now, when I was at art school, my mum had a job in a firm in a little factory making springs. And it was a factory of 12 people behind a pub in Harsden, and I used to go there in the evenings and weekends. It was a little job. But in the firm, and springs were all handmade, and so there'd be tiny, tiny springs, like watch springs, tiny things, to walloping great springs, all made by hand, of wonderful, really wonderful skills, but all handmade. But this firm knew that somewhere in the sort of sky, there's a bloody great edifice, a firm called Terry, who makes springs for the gentry and the million, a massive firm. So it was a bit like making your own motorbike and knowing there's a firm out there called Rolls-Royce. It's that sort of relationship, you know. So Terry has somehow got stuck in Grange's mind. So when I sit next to this fella 40 odd years later, and he says his name's Terry, I can't resist telling him this bloody story, you see. And it turns out to be the same guy, same firm. Now, it's another little illustration of how life is formed by accidents, and some of them are wonderfully, you know, happy, and it never was other than that.
Okay, I have one last question for you, and then I promise I will hand over to the burning questions in the audience. What advice would you give to a young designer now?
Work 80 hours a week.
Simple.
It's a complicated thing, and our trades become so massively complicated. I mean, you've got design which spans entertainment at one end to rigorous purpose at the other, and every shade of inventive opportunity between. I mean, I don't have an instinctively great sympathy for design art. You know, if I see something called a chair, I expect to sit on it, and I expect to enjoy sitting on it. But it's become a token. It becomes simply a means of describing something, and there's no intention of it being a chair to be sat upon. It's a piece of art. It's an art object. That in itself's fine too, but it just sticks in my throat that it's called a chair.
I would agree. Do we have any questions in the audience? I'm sure we have. Just sort of here.
The tactile is very apparently involved with hand or with the food mixer, courier shaver. But does it indeed transfer to the larger scale? And does it have a role in sort of legibility of a larger thing like the taxi or the train?
So just so everybody heard that, you're talking about a sense of the tactile in yes. Some of the kind of smaller objects, and the gentleman's asking if that transfers to some of the larger objects like the Intercity 125 or the taxi.
I think it's a really central question, because if you design things for people to use, then sooner or later the actual moment of interface with them, it comes up. Now, there are some things that have lost the need for tactility, like these silly bloody mobile phones and things. Although oddly enough, I do think that a lot of that is likely to be recast and reviewed, and people might find that there's that little bit more reassurance if there's some absolute clear response. This is easily talked about, but bloody difficult to achieve. But at the root of every damn thing, I think you've got to embrace the notion that someone's going to enjoy using it. And as long as we've got hands and feet and eyes and things, using it means the engagement of our senses with the thing itself. And whether that is important, therefore, that you really sense the pleasure of holding it, or whether you simply recognise that through holding it, through the way the makers insisted you hold it, it functions, then that's almost even wittier, because it like just come inevitably with the thing. So there are simple examples of this, like it's become not uncommon now to buy primitive things like a spanner or a wrench or a tool, a handheld tool, where because the technology is allowing it, you can change the texture of the surface that you touch, and it can be soft or hard or this, that or the other, and it's a tiny importance, but it doesn't alter the fact that it's an improvement. It's what affluent societies should aspire to, that you should aspire to make every damn thing better somehow. Now, I think I'll bang on a moment if you're not careful about the design week, but it's all about, I think it's all about making the relationship trusting, that if you go to buy a so-and-so, you can trust it to be a pleasure to use. You can trust it to do its job. I mean, I think an interesting example is where aspects of design are I think in conflict. For example, I think that some of the Apple products, I'm not going to make a lot of friends with this, so there we go. But I do think that it's possible to make things so beautiful and bought because they're so beautiful, so absolutely like impeccable. It's in their product. It's a question about. It's more of a remark about the vocabulary, the vernacular of the product makes even straightforward, ordinary people who don't even know what I'm bloody talking about, but they recognise the impeccability, if such a word exists, of the thing. The surface is absolute pleasure to stroke. The corners are absolutely a delight to put your fingers around. And these are like the absolute elements of the excellence of these products. However, the danger is that same success, which gets immensely adored and admired and remarked upon and written up until you begin to think, Christ, I'm really top dog. I really am master of this product territory. And it therefore allows you to only concern yourself with the opinions of your peers. And your peers are not going to say, can you get hold of that control knob? Can you actually find the on-off switch? Now, I've got 3 Apple computers. 2 of them are the same, so I'll say that there's 2. Both of them are bloody difficult to find the switch for the on-off. And it's a conceit. You can't describe it as anything but a sort of super refined conceit that they assume, the designers and the marketing, the whole of the process assumes that you're part of their world. You've been such an ardent admirer that you've been allowed through the door of you knowing where the button is, don't you? The great unwashed, we don't worry about. Leave those to the Samsungs and the cruder end of our trade. The refined end, the really, really refined end, where people smell nice and dress nice, the whole thing's so bloody beautiful that there's secrets that you're let into. You and I know that just round there, if you're smart enough and your fingers are delicate enough, you know that just round that corner is something that you won't know you've moved it, but just round those corners, something that you've been successful because the light comes on here.
I think that's knowing laughter.
But isn't it interesting? I mean, and it does illustrate how far we've come. In all these bloody years when we've been banging on about things being more a pleasure to use, more functionally intelligent, and nobody, I mean, you can't believe how unfertile the ground was when I started. And we've come right through to this super fertility now, where, I think we've gone over the top, that's all. So it's enough of that.
There was another question just on the end there.
I was very taken by a programme a couple of years ago called The Age of the Train, reflecting on the Intercity 125, which obviously you had a significant and then even more significant role in, and Sir Peter Parker's comments about the importance of your work there, which was a kind of early recognition of the value of design to business. That sort of narrative has really developed, it seems to me, in the last 10 years or so, and the idea of design thinking about design methods and approaches having even more significance in business and organisational design. And it seems from your talk today that you've thought a lot about that over the years. Do you think that kind of narrative is overhyped, or do you think there is actually more significant role for design in industry and in sort of redesigning industry in some ways today?
Well, it's another hour's talk you're going to be in for here. It's revelatory, and it's very particularly a good example you take. I was asked to sit in on a meeting with the people who own my train, not the people who run it, but who own it. Now, I didn't know this, but most of my trains are not owned by the people who run them. They're owned by a central firm who's bought all the bloody trains and rent them out. And it works pretty well, in engineering terms, in organisation, money, etc., etc. And what came out in the day was how little the train has changed in the 30-odd years that it's been running. And the fascinating thing is that, assuming they think there's a future for it, and it looks as though it still might be around for another even 20 years, there is a new opportunity to look at it afresh, but particularly from the user's point of view. Now, early on in the history of that particular train, there was one particular accident because in the very beginning models, you could open the door of the train from inside as a passenger. And somebody did open the door when it was moving. It hit a passing post or somebody or something, and there was a nasty affair. And so almost overnight, a big business, almost overnight, they changed the locks on all the doors of the train so that you had to lower the window, lean out, and wrestle with this handle in order to open the door. Now, it's a pretty primitive, it's a real agricultural solution, but effective. So I think they've had hardly anybody, particularly since they've then subsequently, that was the mechanical solution, then the next refinement was produced an interlock so that you couldn't, no matter even if you did lean out, you couldn't release the lock, etc. So you've got a really safe system. But when you compare it to the latest generation of the most boring trains in the world, not style, and boring in terms of function, like the commuter trains, the doors are a minor miracle, aren't they? You walk up, get near the bloody door, and it opens. I mean, it's what ought to happen in your own houses. I mean, the house is one of the most primitive institutions we have, really, when it comes to things like doors and the use of automata and so. So that's a good example of where the train just happens to have fallen way behind in terms of its personal human interface, and like the fact that they don't have guards vans anymore, and so there isn't anywhere to put your big baggage. So if you've ever tried to get on a West Country train on a holiday weekend, I can tell you it's hell. I mean, you can't get through the bloody door for the bags. There's simply not enough room for the bags. And I said to them at the meeting, you're sitting on a time bomb. were there to be, say, a fire on a train caused by I don't know what at the moment, people would die not being able to get out past the baggage. So, I mean, there are even things at that level that are inevitable consequences of a thing almost being the victim of its own success. That there's been no pressure to attend to these quite modest improvements, but all very, very achievable, and I think they're likely to do these things. Did that answer the question at all?
Yeah, I was hoping for a bit of debunking in a way of a lot of design hype around the increasing importance of design and how design is a totalising thing. But I don't want to prejudge what you might say.
Well,
What is the next question even?
well, it's. I think my answer's covered by the spectrum that now design covers. You know, designing for its own sake sometimes. But in fairness, it's more about the extent of the refinement you want to get into, how penetrating you're going to take this. I suppose going back to the medical analogy, you know, people are going to die anyway, but you can extend their life by minutes or hours or this, that and the other if you do more and more weird things. So you could say there's a point at which, is it worth it? Or shouldn't you be able to use your energies in somehow over there? Not necessarily a bit of do-gooding abroad, but a bit of do-gooding here, where we're a very funny society. That's another bloody lecture entirely, I tell you.
And I know lots of people keen to ask questions, so I'm going to come from this side of the room. Yes, thank you.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk how helpful the Council of Industrial Design was in your formative years, a sort of top-down approach. Do you think we're in need of a sort of similar Council of Industrial Design these days with the power it used to have in the 1950s and 60s?
I think that's a lot to do with politics. And politics and world politics is immensely decided by money, immensely decided by the affluence. And I can now see that we were still enjoying the posturing of being a wealthy nation, where you could afford what's a relative indulgence to insist, for example, that all the signage on the motorways is impeccable. The world admired and envied our motorway signing because it was absolutely unsmirched, it was absolutely unaffected, and it was never compromised by commerce. But not today, my friend. If you get on the motorway today, you're not sure whether that sign's pointing to bloody Costa or New Haven, are you? I mean, because, you know, the Costa's paying so much money that they're taking the premier part of the signing, if you look at it brutally. So we've got a mad conflict. Now, I happen to think that that's where public money, which is what it comes down to, has to be spent in order that we don't absolutely overwhelm our whole public scene with commerce. And I bang on about wind turbines and all the rest of it, but there comes times when you hope that there's people in authority, people who are ultimately the top managers, who have taste, who have judgment, who have sympathy, and have enough humanity to take a pretty good broad view of what's worth really looking after and what you're going to just let go because of commerce. A pretty bloody tricky job, and I think, I don't envy any politician any of those jobs. I mean, oddly enough, what you would hope is that there could be like a consortium of agreement between the buggers who sell coffee that they're never going to put a coffee shop sign on the motorways. Mr. McDonald's or Mr. Costa or Never or whatever the things are called, they all come to agree that England's one country where we're not going to really bugger up the scene with our advertising on motorways, only on motorways. We'll all agree. I mean, that would be, I think that would be a bit of really good corporate spend. It's wishful thinking, I know.
Yeah, I can't see it happening. So. One last question. Yes, thank you.
you feel when you see
Sorry.
How do you feel when you see what clearly copies of your designs? Do you feel flattered or annoyed when you see copies? So of the
when they're copied.
When they're copied and you see them out in production in shops, do you feel flattered or annoyed? Or neither?
It stirs a funny sort of emotion, because a little bit of you is flattered that someone thought it was worth copying. But equally, it's I can't think of a good analogy, but it's such you get so personally involved. I mean, that's the balmiest part of the job, really. You know, I'm endlessly writing to chairmen who never heard of me, who inherited something I did 50 years ago, 40 years ago, and they're buggering it up. And so this voice comes out the past and says, Lloyd, what you up to? Now, I haven't got a leg to stand on, you know, and probably haven't got a leg to stand on commercially, which I'm very alert to. And I have no shame whatsoever in thinking commercially. I'm very happy about with that. I've had some of my closest friends are on the straightforward commercial side of the, you know, my client base. And they're often the decent, very straightforward people. They've got a commercial job to do. So I don't mind thinking about commerce as really the first, you know, one of the first handmaidens I have to get on with. So I'm alert to what the world does to things, and I think it would be nice if copying was just for its own flattering sake. It's just a very tricky territory. And it's also true that there is nothing new under the sun. So it would be possible, I suspect, that if they lived long enough, somebody might have, who's just copied something I've done today, to then point out that, oh, but don't get so snotty, Grange, because you copied it from so-and-so 20 years before. So we all inherit learning, and we all inherit, you know, assemblies. I think mostly what we do is reassemble learning from something or somebody else in what you hope's a suitable way. And suitable means not only it flatters your own ego, but it actually is entertaining enough and desirable enough to be a success commercially.
I don't know about you, but I would love to sit here all afternoon. But we're already over time, and I'm conscious there's another talk after this. So I want to say a massive thank you to all of you for coming, and a huge thank you to Sir Kenneth Grange.